reason don't want to be shown on the camera, please turn your cameras off. Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot, Nicole. So Nicole and I welcome everyone at the next Art and Conversation seminar. Today we're discussing cinema. As usual, we have two specialists from two different domains to talk about cinema. And our two speakers will present their talks, and after that we'll have a discussion. So everyone will have a chance to ask a question or leave a comment. Please use the chat or just raise your hand so we know that you had a question. So we'll begin with our first speaker is Tim Smith. He's a professor of cognitive psychology at the Birkbeck, University of London. He's the head of the Cognition in Naturalistic Environment Lab. Professor Smith investigates how people perceive audiovisual media, such as television and cinema. He also investigates how media shapes the developing brain. Professor Smith consults media companies such as DreamWorks. In his research, he uses different methods such as computational modeling, behavioral experiments, electrophysiology, and even qualitative methods. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. We are very happy to host you today. Please, whenever you're ready, you can share your screen. Thank you very much. Can you please unmute yourself?
Yep, there we go. Can you hear me now? Yep. Okay.
Yes.
So, and can you see my slides full?
Yes, in full.
Good.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Nicole and Marina, for inviting me to this really exciting series of lectures. This interdisciplinary approach to art is definitely something which is very close to my heart, which will hopefully become evident in this hopefully short presentation. So, as said, I'm a professor of cognitive psychologist, and like probably all of you here, I am absolutely fascinated by the power of cinema. This has always been the case throughout my entire career. One of my favorite pastimes is going to the cinema and losing myself in that moment. I feel like in the last 18 months during the pandemic, the richness and the power of the cinematic experience has really been brought to the fore and actually emphasized by the fact we haven't had access to it and most cinemas have been closed, and our life has ported more into what's happening on the right hand side here, where we're multi-screen viewing all the time. And it provokes me to really question what is going on in cinema that can actually create such rich cognitive emotional experiences, and which of those factors actually port between different types of audiovisual media, mobile phones, screens, online, virtual, etc. The power of cinema, I think, is really nicely captured by this quote from Rian Johnson, the director of Brick, Last Jedi, and Knives Out. In a great special issue of Sight and Sound last year, celebrating cinema during the pandemic, he was quoted as saying that he goes to the movie theatre to forget I even have a physical body, or that there are other people sitting next to me. I want that ethereal rush where the movie is a dream and the crowd around me is like a guitar amp pumped into my own reaction. It's hard to get that on the couch in your well-lit living room with an iPad next to you. That's what I miss about going to the cinema, the collective dream state of being an audience and the moments of total absurdity when you remember you're sitting in the dark with a bunch of snacking, farting strangers. That holy yin and yang of going to the movies, I miss it. There's so much in this quote, so much about the richness of the experience, the full-bodied nature of it, and the incredibly linked nature of it to the cinematic experience and the cinematic stimuli that he's watching. And as a cognitive psychologist, I've always been interested to see what tools we can have, theories and methods to apply to understand this experience. And when I started out with my interest between film and cinema, I looked at what was currently there in film studies and in the film industry itself, and the methods that were used decades ago and are still commonly used today to understand whether a film works or not, or which parts of it works, are really quite rudimentary in their methodologies. It may be audience screenings where you ask them to fill in questionnaires afterwards. You do discussions with the viewers to see which bits seem to work for them and which didn't. Or the most remote method is to see, what's the box office take in the first weekend. If it was good, then maybe we make more of those movies. And the opposite extreme from that is the craft knowledge of the actual filmmakers themselves and how this gets developed over time through introspection, through self-experimentation, and through trial and error through the different films they make. So those are good methods that can be applied to the whole film. But what about going on moment to moment in the brains and the bodies of the viewers. In the revolution in cognitive neuroscience over the last 20 or 30 years, we now have a plethora of methods that we can actually use to study this moment-by-moment processing of the individual and how it relates to the stimulus. And that's what I'm going to give you a quick overview of here today. Here are a selection of techniques. I'm going to mention some of them as we go through, but there are more and more techniques every year. One of the key things to think about when we're studying how people respond to cinema is that we're applying not only the technical methods from empirical psychology, we're also approaching it with the research methods and the statistics we have to hand. So when we're thinking about studying how a particular film sequence provokes a response in an audience, what we're having to do is actually identify what we mean by that particular sequence, which one we're looking at, what are the moments of interest. And then we're going to measure different dimensions of response to that particular stimulus. So let's say, for example, it's a scene from a thriller where a character is being stalked by a menacing character. And we may know that this killer is approaching, and we want to see whether or not the audience members are going to respond with fear in response to this menacing character and how their brains are processing it. So to do this, we may use various devices to actually record their responses. We won't just get one individual in, we'll get a large enough sample that we can infer from that sample to a general population. We record a certain response in response to the particular shocking moment. And let's say we're using neuroimaging data and we've got certain areas of brain activity. We'll get a range of responses where some people will be very low, some will be high, and overall you get this kind of normal distribution where we can conclude a representation of effect of the sample by looking at the mean of it. If we then plot two people onto it, person A in green and person B in red, it may happen that they are close to the mean. And so that we can say that in terms of our measure, their response to that stimulus has been very similar. We may also ask them to relate the content of the sequence afterwards, or answer some questions about it, give us some indication of their thoughts or their behaviors. This will again give us a distribution of their responses, and we can see where these two people lie in relation to each other. So here we're capturing both the general behavior of the mean of the distribution, but also individuals and where they lie on that distribution and relative to each other. And we could also ask them about their affective state. We could ask them what emotions they were feeling, or we could use some objective measures of heart rate, skin conductance or something to try and gauge what their physiological responses are. And so across these kind of measures, we can get indications of when they were similar in their response and when these individuals may be different. So applying this idea to one particular case study and something which I've studied a lot, I'm going to now just quickly go through some studies that have looked at the question of how does cinematic grammar direct cognition. So when I'm thinking about cinema, I treat it as an audiovisual stimulus, and it enables me to actually identify factors of the stimulus that can be quantified and can be tracked over time to see how they may relate to an audience response. I can also then go in and manipulate the stimulus. So I could change things like the shot composition. I could change the color balance of particular objects in the shot. I could change the lighting, the framing of where an object of interest is, or even the depth of field, so how in focus it is. I, as an empiricist, could do this to the stimulus, and in the same way that cinematographers and directors will choose to do this to the stimulus to try to create some kind of optimum with some intended effect. I may also look at the camera movement. So how have the filmmakers chosen to frame it, to zoom in on a target? How have they staged the action? Where have they placed the characters in the frame? How do each one of these decisions influence the way that the audience respond to it? And these are just decisions which are within the actual shot itself. Of course, film is mostly edited together, which is a connected series of shots. So how do the actual decisions about when to cut and what to cut to influence how audiences respond to it? For example, there are various rules of thumb that are applied by editors to try to make the smoothest type of edit possible, as if they're trying to make the editing disappear and the narrative just transcend that in the audience's comprehension. Here is just one of the examples. This is what's called the match on action, which is the rule of thumb that if you want to cut from this medium shot of a lady putting her cup down, you cut to the close-up of the cut at the moment that there's a sudden onset of movement. So as she starts to move, if you cut then, the audience will perceive it as a smoother cut than if you wait until she's finished or before she's even started. So there are intuitions that are already in the film handbooks and filmmakers will refer to that are formalized in a way that they can actually implement them. And what we can do is actually test the impact of those by manipulating those intuitions. Here's another one. This is the 180-degree rule system, which is a system which is used for placing cameras when shooting a scene. So here, if we have two characters, character orange and character blue, and they're in a conversation, this establishes an axis of action, a line of action between the two, meaning that when you first establish the scene by choosing to shoot it from one perspective, like camera A here, the rule of thumb states that it's okay for you to cut to any camera as long as it's on this side of the 180-degree rule. The consequence of moving across the line is that the actual screen location and the direction of the characters flips. And this is thought to confuse viewers. But when I say confuse viewers, this is just the intuition and the language which is used in the film text. And what we can do now is actually we can and have empirically investigated what the consequence is on the moment-by-moment cognition of the viewers. So here's just an example of how, when you put these shot choices together, it can influence directly viewer behavior. So here is a sequence of a cookery show, and what I'm going to show you is gaze data from 64 participants watching the sequence at different times using an eye tracker. And this is a high-speed infrared camera-based system that can track the viewer's pupil location and project it back onto the screen to see where they're looking. Now, something that struck me when I first started eye tracking viewers watching movies is how incredibly coordinated their gaze is. If you have a sequence like this, which is relatively rapidly edited, got lots of shallow focus, lots of mobile camera, their gaze coordinates here, remember, each dot is a gaze coordinate of each participant, and the blob is the statistically optimal cluster of their gaze at any moment in time. This blob only occupies about 5% of the screen area. The directors are having such control over how you're watching the sequence that everyone is pretty much looking in the same place at the same time. There's only a few moments when it cuts to a slightly longer shot, or there's more objects of interest, like there where you have the spoon and the cup, and here you've got the two faces and the hands, that you get more than one center of interest. Now, these are deliberate compositional decisions the filmmakers are making. If you compare this to, this is a sequence from Dogville by Lars von Trier. This is a famously composed Brechtian piece, which has lots of long takes, lots of long shots, lots of mobile camera, which is not edited according to the continuity editing rules. Now here we have a lot less viewers, but if you look at where the dots are focused, there are moments where they all look in the same place, and then there are moments where they're looking at different points in the image because it's more complex. So the director's compositional decisions can have direct consequences on where you look, and that has consequences on what you see and what you subsequently respond to. So taking this further forward, using eye tracking, we can see where's this initial kind of this contact point between my cognition and the stimulus. Where am I looking? What is the visual information that is likely going to make it into my conscious awareness of the scene? We can also look at what the consequences are on brain activity. And there's been lots of wonderful work using fMRI in response to film viewing. A lot of this was pioneered at the start of the 2000s by work like Yuri Hassan in the States. He studied how viewers were responding to films by taking large sections of films, like 45-minute sequences from things like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and showing them to participants in the scanner. Now, anybody who's been in an MRI knows it's not the most comfortable or natural cinematic experience. There's lots of clanging and you're stuck in a bore and you can't move. But even with all those negative parts of the experience, what Hassan and colleagues was surprised to find is that when you actually put individuals in a scanner and then you take their brain activity data and you map it onto a common reference frame and align it frame by frame to the movie, what you find is a surprising amount of correlation of the activity of the regions of the brain across different individuals. It's like their brains are actually ticking together and processing the stimulus in a very similar way. He found that overall, in this study, he had 45% of the cortical activity was significantly correlated across participants. And they had highest correlation in areas associated with primary sensory function like vision and audition, and then subsequently in language, face, and place, and recognition and memory. They also shown that the differences between the movies have direct consequences of how similar our brain activities are. So here he looked at the intersubject correlation, which is the amount of the cortex which is correlated in its activity across different films. If you take a naturalistic shot, this is just people interacting in Washington Square Park, here there isn't any editing, it's not really much composition, there's no clear kind of narrative to it. You have a very low level of intersubject correlation. Whereas if you go to Curb Your Enthusiasm, which is a more dramatically composed sequence, but lots of mobile camera, lots of long takes, you have an increase in the intersubject correlation. When you go to Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, you get up to about 45%. And if you go to Alfred Hitchcock in a TV episode, Bang, You're Dead, he gets over 65% of the cortex is synchronized across participants. So different types of stories composed in different ways can really drive similarity in processing. And I've shown this in the eye movements as well, in the Dynamic Images and Eye Movement project, where we gathered hundreds of participants watching a wide selection of video sequences, and we can quantify how clustered their gaze is at every frame of the movie. So here they're more spread out, as you can see by the size of the blob, and here they're much closer together. And then we could look at that in relation to the shot size. Now, shot size is a way of thinking about how close is the camera to the subject of interest. Here we've got a close medium shot where the participant is, the actor is cut off around the waist area, and we go here to an extreme close-up where the face is bigger than the frame. As we look at the gaze clustering, you can see that the clusters get tighter when you move from not having any people in the shot to having this close medium. And then as you get too close to the object of interest, you can no longer see the whole face in the center of your attention. So you have to shift your gaze between different objects like the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. And all of a sudden this cluster breaks up again. So this is a way of directly validating that the shot choice has a direct consequence of how similar the fixation point is of different viewers, and therefore how similar their experience might be of the stimulus. Just one final empirical result I just want to show is what the consequence of adhering to some of these rules of thumb, these continuity editing techniques, can be not just on where you look, but what you perceive in the films. So as I said earlier, filmmakers have developed these techniques because they believe that adhering to them will make the film seem smooth and effortless to process. So I set about, with my colleague John Henderson, validating this. I gave people a very simple task. I told them to watch these film sequences from classic cinema, and all they had to do is push a button when they noticed an edit. I trained them on what an edit was, and they were able to reproduce that quite accurately. And then I let them watch 5-minute sequences of movies. They watched the movies, and then afterwards, I classify each of the cuts in terms of whether or not it adhered to different continuity editing rules. Our baseline is these between scene cuts where there's no direct narrative or visual spatial continuity between one shot and the shot that follows the cut. When you do that, participants were missing about 8% of these cuts. As soon as you move within a shot where you've got continuity of usually dialogue or narrative, the percentage of cuts they missed went up to 25%. And then by far the most missed cuts are these match action ones I said earlier. So all you have to do is cut at the moment of a sudden onset of motion and continue that motion in the next shot, and participants were missing 1/3 of these cuts. So 1/3 of all these cuts are not registering at the point that they can be aware and respond to it when their primary viewing task is to do exactly that. And bearing in mind these are large parts of the visual field are changed entirely and people don't notice it. So these rules that filmmakers have refined over the decades are actually driving viewer awareness. And of course, I don't have time to go into the whole plethora of different empirical approaches we can take to understanding film. Pretty much any question you can ask about an individual or the collective cinematic experience can be formally tested in an empirical framework. We can look at things like attention, as I've shown here, perception awareness, narrative comprehension, emotional impact, affective response and self-appraisal of people's responses. And I'll just put a little shout out to the work of Gal Raz and Talma Handler in Tel Aviv here, who've done some really pioneering work where they can look at self-report emotional intensity and the activity of areas of the brain responsible for embodied processing and theory of mind processing to see how it responds to deeply emotional scenes like the sequence of separation between a mother and child in Sophie's Choice. So something which you might think is rich and incredibly personal, like your emotional response to this traumatic scene, you can track the time course of these processes through the brain and the body. And just to finish off, I want to say that throughout my career of working in film cognition, I've been really open to discussions from different perspectives of film, which is why I'm really excited about the session today. And the need for this triangulation of approaches to film, I think, is really nicely captured in this essay by Maurice Smith, the film philosopher, where he talked about how in order to study aesthetic experience, we should get out of our silos. We shouldn't just look at empirical psychology and only look for theories and frameworks within that, or within neuroscience, or within film theory or phenomenology. By actually being open to others, we can understand different perspectives, and we can actually separate the collective experience of cinema from the individual experience as a way of informing our subsequent research questions and refining our methods. And on that, I'd like to say thank you to all my collaborators, my funders, and my lab, my ever-expanding lab, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim, for such an interesting talk, and I can see there are already many open questions. I would like to introduce our second speaker today, who is Lucy Fife Donaldson, who is a senior lecturer in film studies at the University of St. Andrews. Her research interests include, among others, the staging and presence of performance in cinema and TV, the relationship between bodily affect, agency and effort, genre, especially horror and melodrama, and the contribution of the below-the-line film designers to the materiality of cinema. She's the author of Texture in Film, an interdisciplinary monograph on the concept of texture in relation to mainstream cinema, and co-editor of Television Performance, a collection offering a critical evaluation of performance in television. Lucy, thank you so much for joining us today. Please, when you're ready, share your screen, and we look forward to your talk.
Great, thank you. Yeah, like Tim, I'm really excited about the possibilities for how we might talk to each other about these issues. So I guess I'm going to kind of come at this from the kind of like film theory perspective, and in that I'm one part of that triangle, I guess, so we can kind of think about how to kind of connect those things in the discussion part. So I wanted to, I guess, like talk through some ways in which film has thought about questions of embodiment and affect, and I thought I would do that. Like start us off with a film clip, just to kind of get us thinking about how this is working in a particular film. So I'm going to show you a sequence, and hopefully computers will behave and it won't be too kind of delayed or disrupted. But I have a very short moment from Fast and Furious 7 that I wanted to share with you, and I'll, I guess, explain a little bit more about why I've chosen this when you've watched it. But this is partway through a kind of big action sequence, so I won't say anything more about the narrative. We're thinking more about the body and yeah, how we're responding and how we're being invited to respond to this. Okay.
Lucy, I can't see the clip playing.
Sorry, you can't see it.
I can see the clip, but it's not playing on the screen.
Playing, interesting. Okay, I try sharing it again. Oh,
thank you.
that's okay. Thank you for telling me. Okay, maybe if I don't make it big, maybe that'll help.
Let's try that.
Okay. Is that better?
Yes, but unfortunately I can't hear the audio.
Okay.
I think when you share the screen at the beginning, you need to click playing audio from the computer. When you ask Teams to share the screen.
Okay. Sorry.
It's okay. Teams is not helpful.
This is my fault for trying to do something more complicated. Okay, it's just thinking about it.
Okay, unfortunately, I can't hear the audio still.
Okay, don't worry.
But I don't know if anyone else can, but the video was working fine this time.
Oh, that's okay. We'll forget about it and I can talk around it. Okay, so basically, the reason that I wanted to show you that moment is really because it kind of, I guess, like represents a kind of a particularly affective moment in film, and one that I personally found extremely like affective and embodied. So I guess we can kind of skip right to the kinds of questions that I want to ask about moments like this in film. So you might think about, you know, is there a kind of a moment when you've been watching a film where you've had a kind of particularly embodied response? So I remember watching this in the cinema and really like gripping my seat as this was kind of playing out. And the kind of questions that I want to think about are, you know, how and why are we responding to this? How is the film inviting us to respond? And this is a really kind of key question for me. How do we account for our responses? So, and particularly, how do we write about these responses? So how do we convey through writing an audiovisual experience that is embodied and affective? And one of the key things that interests me about film is relates to this quote from Gilberto Perez, where he says, "The images on the screen carry in them something of the world itself, something material, and yet something transposed, transformed into another world." And this is what he calls the material ghost. So the ways in which film itself is immaterial, you know, what we're watching is essentially light on a screen, but we experience it in a material way and we respond to it in material ways. So one of the kind of key approaches for film studies has been through a kind of a sensory turn, which is particularly informed by phenomenology. So Vivian Sobczak is a kind of key scholar in this area, and her there's a particular chapter in her book Carnal Knowledge called What My Fingers Knew, where she describes kind of how to think about the ways in which spectatorship is informed by a more embodied approach. So she says spectatorship is informed and given meaning by our other sensory means of access to the world, our capacity not only to hear, but also to touch, to smell, to taste, and always to proprioceptively feel our dimension of movement in the world. In sum, the film is meaningful not to the side of our bodies, but because of our bodies. And she goes on to say that perception is always already fleshed out. We do not experience any movie only through our eyes. We see and comprehend and feel films with our entire bodily being, informed by the full history and carnal knowledge of our acculturated sensorium. And these two passages are really kind of key kind of responses to the ways in which film theory had previously thought about spectators for two ways. So firstly, the ways in which she describes spectatorship as being informed by all of our senses, and the way that she kind of thinks about this is not just that we have many senses, but that they engage with one another. So there's a kind of transsensory idea. But kind of prior to this, film theory was very kind of ocular centric. So it was all about vision. So her saying we do not experience any movie only through our eyes is a really kind of key part of of the claim that she's making, and the kind of shift that is happening. And to kind of think through this kind of idea of proprioception, so the ways in which we understand physical action through our bodies. We don't have to be able to kick like Bruce Lee. We don't have to, have done these exact jumps, but we understand what it is to do these things. And just as the action sequence that I was going to show you, in which somebody like almost falls off a bus off a cliff. I've never done that, obviously, but I have some kind of engagement with that physically because of my awareness of how my body works and how it moves. Okay. So for the phenomenologist, a kind of key part of this is imagining or understanding the relationship between the film and the spectator as active, as a kind of reciprocal relationship. So the kind of key metaphor for the phenomenologist is this kind of motion of rubbing your hands together, where you can't distinguish between being touched or touching. And so Sobchak is kind of understanding the relationship between the film and the viewer as a kind of reciprocal relationship. And the important part of this is that she's suggesting that this dynamic is an active one. So there is an active dynamic between film and spectator, just as there is between us and the world. And this is really important. Partly, I mean, I was kind of really interested with the quote that Tim opened his presentation with about this idea of like the collective dream of cinema. So film theorists have prior to this been very kind of interested in thinking about the cinema as a kind of dream space, and in kind of all sorts of ways thinking about the spectator as a kind of a passive receiver of the film. And what Sobchak is doing is thinking about the kind of active dynamic. So it kind of resituates how the spectator might be in their relationship to the film. And a kind of particularly interesting part of this is the way in which Sobchak and another writer who kind of builds on Sobchak, Jennifer Barker, talk about how this dynamic plays out. And this kind of idea of a kind of here and there relationship between us and the film, I think, is really interesting. So Sobchak says, in the film experience, because our consciousness is not directed towards our own bodies, but towards the film's world, we are caught up without a thought because our thoughts are elsewhere, in this vacillating and reversible sensual structure that both differentiates and connects the sense of my literal body to the sense of the figurative bodies and objects I see on screen. So this kind of being caught up both here and there, we're both differentiated from but connected to the bodies and objects that we see on screen. And Jennifer Barker kind of builds on this by saying that we're not in the film, So it's not a kind of complete like dissolving into the film and the bodies in it, but we're not completely outside it either. We exist and move and feel in that space of contact where the surfaces mingle and our musculatures entangle. And this kind of idea of like entanglement is really key to this kind of way of thinking, that we're both here and there. And I think, you know, this gif of the clip that I was going to show kind of indicates this, and how the film's language also kind of gives us a kind of here and there. So we're kind of pushed out and away through like long shots and crane shots, but we're brought in close in key moments. So even the film in this kind of moment is engaging in this kind of here and there relationship. And they both kind of carry this on by thinking, you know, not just about the bodies on screen, but also the ways in which the cinema itself can be thought of as embodied. So this idea of the film itself being a body, and that kind of entanglement and engagement is about a kind of embodied address. So Sobczak, in her earlier book, which is much more kind of thinking through phenomenology, describes this as the cinema using modes of embodied experience. And again, Barker kind of builds on this. Her whole book is about this idea of a kind of a film body, which she takes through chapters on like its skin, its musculature, and its viscera. So she kind of describes the way in which our kind of bodily responses to films might be mimicry in another sense. So not only mimicry of the bodies on screen, of the characters, but of the film itself. Suggesting that perhaps viewers respond to whole cinematic structures, textual, spatial, or temporal structures, for example, that somehow resonate with their own textual, spatial, and temporal structures. So again, this kind of sense of like our being in the world informs how the film itself might be taken to be being in the world. And she expands on this by saying that the film and viewer shared certain deep-seated muscular habits, beginning with the very tendency to move through the world in an upright position. We in the film are both inclined that way, as we're inclined to move and look forward, to face things directly. We're both disoriented when we're positioned otherwise. The film adopts our proprioception, the sense we have of our bodies in space. It may confirm it or thwart it by its own movements, but it is always indebted to it. And this is a really kind of, I think, interesting and kind of persuasive way that she starts to kind of think beyond just a relationship between, you know, our body and a body on screen, but how the film might be thought or kind of considered to be embodied or expressing a kind of bodily action, and this kind of sense of things that we share, this idea of kind of orientation. It also starts to bring in the idea of film aesthetics. So the ways in which films situate the camera, the editing, and sound. So she kind of draws this in through ideas around technology. So the technologies that enable those behaviors, and kind of makes these interesting links between the human body and the film body. So, you know, that there might be a kind of paralleling between the camera and the cornea, the zoom lens and the inner ear. So she says that they're different, obviously biological and mechanical, but that they might share certain ways of being in, seeing and grasping the world, despite those differences. So the kinds of things that we might think about here is, you know, how camera movement might be understood as embodied, and whether the quality of camera action, you know, indicates a kind of a way of moving through the world. It indicates something about that kind of material space. It might tell us something about how we're being kind of positioned in relationship to a moment of film. So, you know, in a moment like this, in an action sequence, is there a difference between the body that we see on screen, which is kind of grasping to move through space and is kind of having difficulties, and the kind of mastery of the film body as it moves through that space, that it is able to kind of be above and below, go in and out quite easily, whereas the human body is kind of challenged, and falling and jumping and kind of stressing, and I guess the question there is like, where is our body in relationship to those different bodies? So this is also, questions about proximity, about framing, and how those decisions might kind of indicate a kind of experience. And equally, we could kind of think about that in relationship to editing, and also sound as well. Okay. So my particular interest is in this idea of the kind of the film as the material world, and I think there are ways in which the phenomenological perspective can, for me certainly, sometimes kind of push us too much into that kind of space of entanglement, and doesn't allow us to kind of completely recognize the distinctions between ourselves and the film. So Ian Garwood's book, The Sense of Film Narration, has a really kind of useful setting out of sensory theory, and he talks about this kind of distinction between us and the film. So he says, even in moments of closeness, the actual absenting of the viewer from the film world allows him or her a position where the sensuousness can be felt and observed. And then he goes on to say, by tracing these resonances, the viewer becomes involved in a way of reading that is both sense-aware and respectful of the difference between our world and the film's world of its own. And I think this is, for me at least, important, particularly for the ways in which it understands the material world of the film as being created by being shaped. So I think there's something in this kind of idea of the film body that erases other kinds of bodies who are really important to creating that world. So my kind of interest in below the line labor, particularly sound designers, and costume designers, production designers, is that these are the people who are responsible for creating that world that we respond to, and that they are absolutely thinking about things like feel, like texture, as in the quote from Richard Silbert, or the kind of feel of a sound that Alan Splett talks about there. So I think that can kind of get lost in some of these ways in which phenomenology is interested in a kind of permeability between us and the film. So just to kind of finish off, I think one kind of key part of this is the ways in which writers like Sobczak and Barker push us to really engage with the idea of experience. So the idea of kind of thinking through how you respond to a film, the kind of messiness of response, is something that film theory previously kind of pushed away and wanted to kind of get rid of, essentially. But Sobczak is kind of bringing us back into thinking about this kind of idea of feeling, idea of experience, and she does this through kind of moments of her own response. And I think this is a really kind of important way of understanding what the film is doing. Not to say that this is the only response, but saying this is a response that has come from the film, and we can kind of think about that through what the film is actually doing. But that recognizing that experience and response is really important to how we engage with film. So I will leave it there, and we can have our discussion.
Thank you very much, Lucy, and for your very interesting talk. Definitely there are many overlaps and points of discussion. I just would like to remind everyone that if you would like to pose a question, please just raise your virtual hand and we'll invite you to unmute yourself and ask your question. But we would like to kickstart the conversation by asking our two speakers to kind of respond and comment on each other's presentation. Trying to think if there is one topic that resonated particularly with them and how would that apply to their own research. So Tim, perhaps would you like to go first?
Yes, thanks for the great presentation, Lucy. I think phenomenology is definitely the touch point between the cognitive neuroscience of film and film theory in general, because I think we are trying to get at the same thing. We're just using different theoretical, historical, cultural backgrounds as a way of motivating it. And for me, studying phenomenology when I was an undergraduate in psychology was really critical to engage with the bigger, richer sensory experiences. Because the application of phenomenology to art and kind of rich, divergent experiences, I think, was really something that I engaged with because it had the richness of description, which I think at the time, 20 years ago, the more cognitive oriented kind of sensory processing side of perception was just very cold and stale seeming. And that is a problem from the visual cognition, that it often has been very pared down for methodological reasons and for kind of research reasons. The stimulus that you have to use is so separate from reality, from the complexities of reality, that it's often to port your understanding and your findings from that to something as rich as art or cinema. And I think that's why we need to have that different perspective. And the quotes you were using, the different approaches to studying the film experience, of the transmodality of it, the multimodality, the undulation of those factors within an individual across time in the film. Those are all really critical factors that I think are only recently starting to be engaged with and tackled empirically. And I think they entirely are possible and feasible to actually question empirically, to come up with new methodologies for new approaches to actually find how how different sensory systems will work in coordination to trigger a particular response to a moment of film stimuli. But we need to step away from some of the more controlled paradigms we usually have in experimental psychology in order to embrace that and actually think about how things change over time, how things are combining together across different measures, rather than just stick to my one method of choice like eye tracking. I have to use eye tracking in combination with some of the physiological records or self-report or introspection. And as I said in my talk, is like try to triangulate that, because it's clearly the case, as you all know, working with some of those below the line professionals, is when they're doing sound design, they're crafting things in multiple dimensions simultaneously. They're trying to trigger a really rich experience that they know will work in coordination with the costume design, with the lighting, with the action, with the performance, with the narrative. No one is working in isolation, they're working towards the whole. So if we are to understand the cinematic experience, breaking it down into one dimension is completely diminishing what the intention of the thing was. And that's a provocation that I think can be understood by people from the empirical by actually engaging a bit more with some of the theories and approaches that you take.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I quite agree. One of the things that, I mean, I guess you like get the sense that I'm not like completely like a phenomenologist. I have some hesitancies, but I think that kind of way in which and my own kind of training is in kind of close textual analysis and thinking about style. And for me, phenomenology's interest in the concrete and in the detail and being precise about what something actually is and how it appears and how we perceive it in its context appealed to me as somebody kind of coming from that tradition. So I think it's, you know, that's incredibly helpful because, you know, those, as I said right at the beginning, the kind of key question for me is always like, how is the film inviting this? So, you know, as you were absolutely pointing out as well, that key to all of this is questions of framing, of editing, of camera movement, that these are the things that are shaping how we respond. I mean, I guess it's really interesting to hear you kind of say that the thing that needs to happen empirically is to kind of push that multimodality. And I was kind of curious when you were talking, partly because this is something that gets left out in all sorts of ways. I think, you know, in sensory studies as well, is like, where does sound come into this? So like, how do you track response to sound, which we know is a very like embodied phenomenon, right? So we hear through our bodies. They are like kind of literally the receivers, or like, you know, of sound waves. So yeah, I was kind of curious to how the kinds of approaches that you're taking might account for or kind of think through what sound is doing. Because often, I guess, like your example of the kind of the editing, we're so unaware of sound. Unless you're really thinking about sound, you're not actually kind of conscious of or engaged with what it's doing, which is, you know, precisely what sound designers are kind of interested in.
So my response used to be, well, I work in vision, so leave that for someone else. But that is so glib and is so completely naive to how vision works, in that it can be treated, as you said, like the ocular dominance approach. Oh, it's, you know, imagery, just because it occupies the largest part of our sensory neurosensory system, you know, it's all of our experience and it dominates everything else. But I think what's really important from the quotes that you talked about was the implicit priming effect of multimodality. And sound is such an important one for that. So in the last few years, with a few students, we've been trying to tackle it head on. And I always had a sense that when I'm trying to capture what's leading to that coordination in their gaze, and what's leading to that edit blindness effect, is a big combination with the audio. And I demonstrated this in a follow-on from the edit blindness effect, where I ran it on participants with similar clips. I was manipulating various factors of the match action to see whether the motion was driving the effect, if it was before the cut or after the cut. So really precise manipulation of frames. And I could show that if I removed some of the motion post-cut, that all of a sudden the effect would kind of diminish and they'd start to see more of the shots. And so I thought, oh, great, so this is really validating the primacy of the image. But then I thought, I'm still curious about the sound. So I ran half of the stimuli without any soundtrack. And all edit blindness disappeared entirely. They were watching exactly the same sequence. They were looking in the same place. But no matter what I did with the motion, they noticed all of the shots. And I kind of broke it down. I thought, well, it makes absolute sense. I think you quoted this as well. The sound is always continuous. It's always there, whether it's an environmental rumble, an acoustic, a sound, a score or dialogue. We know that sound designers don't work or respect the cut. They only hard audio cut if they want to make an effect. They bleed in. And so they create this alternate perceptual scaffold upon which you can build vision. And it guides the interpretation. And so that got me fascinated by the richness of the sound design and the role it plays. And subsequently, we've been looking at it a lot more in real-world experience and other contexts as well. And there is a growth in kind of multimodal audio-visual research that's trying to figure out how to study this. But if you're talking about the kind of things you talked about, like the bass, the rumble, the physiological feeling of the sound through the body, how that triggers the affective system, how you get synchronization of biorhythms like heartbeats, these things, like, they're studied in fragments, but nowhere near are they coordinated at the point that we really need to capture how powerful they are in cinema. And the thing that always constantly boggles my mind is hundreds of millions of pounds are invested technologically to get the right sound system in the cinema to drive the right effect. Yet there isn't the tying together of the empiricist and the approach to actually validate that it's working exactly the way they expect it to in the moments they expect it to. And I think there's great growth for that combination, going from the theory to the industry to the practice to the science, so we can round that square.
And certainly not something that all filmmakers have control over, as well. That the kind of this, particularly I know that like sound levels, unless you have like particular kinds of access to cinemas or are able to kind of demand certain things of them, films are not being shown in the way that they might have been designed as well,
Yeah.
which obviously.
And it's just ridiculous when you've got it completely balanced wrong, and then massive individual differences. We know that hearing range changes massively as you age, and so then you should have screenings that are balance the different levels. In fact, there is autism-friendly screenings where they do exactly that. They change the lighting, they change the sound level, because they understand individual differences are important for appreciation. Why is it only happening for very small groups? You know, that we have the capacity now to do it much more reactively, to tailor the cinematic experience, to optimize it. But only through this kind of discussion and the research can we know how to do that.
Thank you very much, both. And I think you highlighted the fact that the thinking about embodiment in cinema is fairly recent, and perhaps one of the reasons why is that also the technology now enables us to study, well, to manipulate sound in different ways that before wasn't possible. So perhaps that's also something to think about. I can see that Joel has his hand raised. Would you like to pose your question?
Hey, wonderful. Thank you so much, Tim and Lucy, for your presentation. Lucy asked one of the questions I was going to ask about sound and how that actually, Tim, you focused more on the kind of the ocular visual side of things, but how do sound things affect that? But the second question I want to ask has to do with the environmental factors that are involved in both phenomenology and in kind of the cognitive sciences. And Tim, you mentioned that you're watching a film in an MRI machine. That in and of itself is a distinctive cinematic environmental approach, not just what's on the screen, but how my body is reacting to and responding to that. And so I'm curious from both of you, even just in our recent era of we're watching films now predominantly on our phones or on our laptops or on our, we can't go to the theater in the same way, how environmental factors play into both of your arenas of study. The phenomenology of the environment and how it affects my body, and then Tim, the kind of cognitive side of what's going on there as well. So thanks very much.
Lucy, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I guess, this is a really interesting question, and a one that is kind of more and more relevant, as you say, like that we're watching films in different ways, and how can we, if one of the ways in which we're thinking through this kind of idea of experience is to kind of think about our own experiences and kind of our own situations. I mean, this is something that when I teach a module on sensory film and invite the students to think about not just what the film is doing, but kind of moments when they have had particular kinds of responses. So I got them to do a piece of writing reflecting on a particular experience where they were kind of thinking about their bodies or, kind of engaging with this. And I was interested that so many of them wrote about watching a film at home with other people and how the aspects of that environment, whether it be about the comforts of other people or the discomforts of other people, and how that kind of shaped a particular kind of experience. So I think, and that's, I guess, one of the difficulties of the kind of analysis that I do, that it doesn't need to, but sometimes we kind of understand it as like occurring in a perfect cinema environment, or that we're seeing the film in the way that it was intended, which is not how we're seeing a film often. Or even, as we've just been talking about, a cinema doesn't kind of deliver that. And I think it's a really kind of, the kind of thing that I think should be thought about more and prompt interesting questions about what films are inviting us to do and how we engage with them and kind of what they're for as well, and how the kind of materiality of our environment might shape a particular experience for us. So like the ways in which you might I guess, like particularly in relationships to certain genres, so that you might deliberately watch a horror film in a way that is going to dampen its affect, or heighten it. So watching at home might be a way to kind of draw on the comforts of your environment in a way that will reshape your own engagement with a film. So yeah, that's a bit of a rambly answer, but those are the kinds of things that makes me think about.
There are so many things to talk about when you talk about the environment, the context of viewing. And I've been thinking about it endlessly for the last 18 months because of this radical change in our consumption from the cinema, and whether or not the debate of whether or not cinema is going to exist in its current form. Is there any purpose for it, given the advances in home screening technologies? There's been surprisingly little literature actually kind of trying to directly test the live cinematic experience. There's a lot of stuff about emotional contagion, collective experience in cinema, but really getting down to kind of the moment by moment yoking of individuals to the screen experience. A lot of when you look in the literature, it actually ends up pointing to kind of my work or Yuri Hassan's work, which is individuals viewing it at different times, then having kind of an abstracted collective experience. And that's, of course, it's not the same thing. One study which I think kind of speaks to the interesting dichotomy between similarity in experience in one way, but difference based on context, is by an ex-PhD student of mine, Stephen Hind, who did a study with the late Tom Trushanko a few years ago, where he was interested in immersion in the cinema and whether screen size affected this. Because everyone was saying, IMAX is bigger, is better, projection is better than a small presentation to feel immersed in the content. But you can't just compare an IMAX screen to a mobile phone because there are so many visual differences. The visual angle it subtends, the luminance of the screen, all these things are not controlled. So you need to take an empirical approach to it. So they did a study where they took a projector and they projected a large image far away, and then they moved the projector closer and they project the same size image closer. So when you look at it in terms of the angle it subtends on your retina, it was exactly the same. The image is identical. They dampen down the luminance, so the brightness is identical. Literally, you're seeing the same thing. But you're in a physical space where you know that one of them is further away and bigger, and one of them is closer and smaller. And then they asked people to do a continuous rating task of how immersed they felt in the stimulus. And they do this very simple task where they just bisect a line throughout the movie, and they've shown that you get this kind of time course of immersion where they get more and more immersed as the movie goes on. And what they found is that when participants were watching the bigger screen further away, they always reported that over the course of the movie, they got more immersed than if it was exactly the same screen closer. So the knowledge of the context changed the way they introspected and self-reported their experience. And it's that kind of knowledge of the context which I think is really interesting and needs to be studied more. Because we can optimize things to the nth degree. In actual fact, the resolution, the dynamic range of my iPhone is probably better if I'm watching a film here than if I'm watching it on my TV downstairs. So the image quality can be much better. The audio experience can be better because I have noise cancelling headphones on. But do I comprehend the content so well? Do I emotionally respond to it? Do I engage with it and kind of have lasting consequences of the content when it's small versus where it's far away? And that's even without talking about the collective aspects of shared experiences on them. And the one final thing I just want to say is I'm really interested in these kind of dynamics because what we know from just looking at the cognitive side of how people are attending and processing film is that you go through this modulation of experience. And I think Lucy mentioned this, where maybe it was Garwood was talking about how you have these moments of losing yourself and moments of great self-awareness and kind of contextual awareness, where there's points where you are entirely in the movie, and there's other moments where you're entirely in your body and you're reflecting on the person who's munching the popcorn next to you. And I'm fascinated by that kind of modulation. How do you get lost and how is that released? How do filmmakers use that and what are the consequences cognitively and effectively of those dynamics?
And I guess just to add, I think that's really interesting, and particularly these kinds of questions, you talked a lot about immersion there, and that being a kind of key word that comes up in like how we're thinking about cinema experience, or that kind of, you know, the ideas of embodiment, and in some ways the phenomenological perspective pushes us towards this kind of like idea of like the ideal cinema experience is one of immersion, of like complete engagement with the film. And I think the question that you asked us, Joel, is like prompts us to again like think about that kind of range, but that we could also kind of not critique exactly, but kind of think through that immersion isn't the only thing to be interested in. Like, it is interesting, but like you were just saying there, the kind of that modulation is an inevitable part of when we watch films, wherever we watch films, and thinking through why that happens, how that happens, is a really kind of interesting part of these kind of questions, I think. So,
and I think it's really it's of great pertinence right now, because with streaming platforms, there is no single viewing. It's not like you go in and do the A/B screening in the 1950s of the cinema. You dial into an episode of Netflix, you stop at some arbitrary point, you fast forward, you speed it up. You know, there are so many opportunities for viewing, and a lot of our consumption, we're also on our phones or we're having conversations. It's like, is that a more impoverished or a less intended viewing experience, given that, you know, masses of budget is being put into this streaming and it's changing the way we consume it? I think understanding that there isn't just one way of viewing, I think, is important to then further understanding what can you accomplish with these cinematic experiences if you embrace the context and the other ways of viewing.
Thank you so much, both. It's it's very interesting. Melis, I can see that you have your hand raised. Would you like to pose your question?
Oldham, can you hear us? Yes. Okay. Hi. We're actually a bunch of people watching this together at the Kadir Has University in Istanbul. My name is Albert. I'm a professor of affective computing, so I have a question a little bit related to computing sciences for Tim, and then maybe another question for both of our speakers. When you first showed us the brain synchronization and different material producing different kinds of synchronization in the viewers, did you, for example, also looked at the material with a, let's say, a computational visual attention model that would kind of show you, for example, the saliency distribution and whether the entropy of that saliency map would be correlated? Because it's possible that, you know, I can present you with a visual material which gives a very clear saliency target, and then that would, of course, create a much more focused, you know, like synchronized viewing experience. But if it's distributed all over the place, then people might be focusing on different things. That's a maybe small question. But the other one is, you know, I'm curious about the, it's a bit of a broader thing. We have cross-modal neurons in our hippocampus. They are very happy when the sound and the vision kind of synchronize with each other. They, you know, they fire, etc. We like multimodality when it's coherent. But this is a very, you know, low-level perceptual thing. But that's not the only way we engage with movies. We also engage it at a much higher cognitive level. And how would you measure the effect of multimodality at that level? I mean, perceptual experiments are easier maybe to manipulate the different channels. But when a person is engaging with the material at a let's say deeper level, where first-person viewing or viewpoints are not so important anymore, or the visceral response becomes much less important than the cognitive response. How do you measure the effect there? That's maybe a question to both of you. Yeah, thank you.
Those are not two small slide questions. So the first one, computational saliency, for anybody who doesn't know, massive progress has been made in creating computational proxies for early visual areas, where we can take a digital image, we can decompose it into pixels that have luminance and color values, and we can treat them as we think the early visual system does. So we can create computational proxies for what the early visual system will do. And because we know that gaze and attention responds to discrepancies in the stimulus in a certain way, that if you have the girl in the red coat in Schindler's List, which is black and white, that is salient. It is prominent on a single color dimension. And if viewers are just shown that, their gaze and their reaction times to the red girl will be much quicker than to anywhere else in the scene. We know that attention is biased in this involuntary way to it. So those computational models are really powerful. Even before we get to deep learning models, if we just look at low-level visual saliency models that are combined together, yes, so in the DM project, we applied individual feature computation, and we used rock curve analysis to predict how much it would account for gaze location on every frame of videos in our data set compared to comparable frames from a random data set. And we were able to formalize exactly how much of the variance in gaze was accounted for by each of those dimensions in isolation and in combination. And what we were able to show is that about 70% of the gaze can be predicted just by knowing where the motion is in the image. And that relates again to the match action and the kind of compositional techniques. We also showed what you said, which is that if we look at the moments where gaze is more clustered, what you find is actually the contrast of the saliency is more pronounced. So when everyone's looking in one place, it's likely that the saliency is also pointing towards that one place. And this is how you draw the circle. So the cinematographers, the directors, the lighting designers, the set designers, they've all worked together to optimize the image. And what they've been doing is optimizing the salience, which then guides our attention to it and makes it easier to view. If you have more dispersed points of salience, a wider distribution across the image, there's lots of things flickering around, like in the Dogville example, where because there's no set, there's people in the background which are irrelevant for the current plot, but they're salient. And so then people look in different places. So yes, we can do that. We can account for your gaze location quite quickly. Deep learning models take it to another level. Deep learning is you probably all heard, is a recent advancement of machine learning that can be trained on data and then try to find patterns that you would not be able to deterministically put into your data. We've been working with deep learning saliency models recently, and they work incredibly well because they also pick up semantics. They track things like faces, like hands, objects of interest, incidentally in terms of where it's predicting the gaze. So then you start to get at this other point that you talked about, which is the perceptual level. And it then gets into an interesting point because we know that when you're processing sensory input, there is a lot of noise in the input. And the way to disambiguate noise is to use prior experience and perception to actually put in candidates for what you think is actually being seen. And that can then narrow perception and it can optimize your signal processing. And we know that in gaze guidance, when we're looking at natural scenes, what you expect to see and what you're looking for can really guide where you look. In film, there seems to be less of an input of that because the low-level signals, the motion, the camera movement, all that stuff is really kind of like forcing us to watch it in a certain way. So it's much harder for us to look away from where the directors want you to look in most mainstream cinema. But what you see when you look there and why you think you're looking there, it is something else. And it's something else which often isn't tested to get people's self-reflection and kind of comprehension of what's being seen. And in terms of the longer term consequences of what that is in terms of what people are perceiving, how they're reflecting on it, how it's affecting them personally, those are all things that it's just very difficult to operationalize because then it's massively idiosyncratic. And yeah, there's a lot of work to be done there. But I think we're just at that cusp of actually moving from sensation to perception in terms of the semantic features of the models. And if you're working in this domain, then email me because I want to know what you're up to. Sorry, that was long-winded and technical.
Lucy, would you like to add anything?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I do have anything to add. Sorry.
Well,
Yeah.
perhaps
we'll go on to the next person.
Perhaps I have just a slightly follow-up question, because one of the things that we know does affect how we perceive images and movies in this case. And I'm thinking of last week we had Neil Kahn, who talks about visual languages, and basically cinema is a visual language, so something that will have an impact on how we see and watch a movie is how familiar we are to certain techniques. So I wondered, what is your take, and what do you think would be the influence of, say, literally the literacy and expertise, and if in a way that expertise kind of mediates the expectations that you have, and therefore the question before was talking about the congruency between audio and visuals, and yes, even if we know that generally people like this congruency, that is perhaps not what will engage someone that is more expert and is more used to certain cinema techniques, and therefore the novelty and what will engage that person will be something different compared to a congruent stimulus. So yeah, I just wanted to have your thoughts about that.
I mean, I guess the thing that I think that probably is true, particularly, I guess, if we're thinking along the lines of, you know, what is the kinds of responses that might be expected, and what, I mean, I guess for me, it's partly like this taps into things like genre, and kind of, so not so much the ways in which we're trained to watch films, though I think, you know, you're right, that's part of it, but maybe, like, for me, I'd want to kind of think about the kind of the expectations that you go into a film with. So like when you're watching an action film, you're kind of prepared to engage with it in a particular kind of way, and that might be a more kind of pronounced, a more kind of embodied way, or you might kind of immediately think of it as more kind of embodied. I guess the other part of that for me is that we have to be careful not to kind of universalize bodies, and that we're shaped by our culture as well. So, you know, when Subject talks about our acculturated sensorium, that is a kind of key part of that we're not kind of approaching these kinds of questions from a kind of, you know, all bodies respond in the same kinds of way. We all have the same kinds of responses. But that we're thinking about, you know, what are the kind of possibilities that the film is inviting, but we're also trying to think about how we might engage with a kind of, again, that multiplicity, but how that multiplicity is organized through different cultural experiences or different, yeah, I think I'll leave it there. But those are the things that I immediately think of.
Thank you. I can see that we only have 10 minutes left and there are 2 people queuing for questions. So would you like to pose your question, Alina? And then I can see Marina is next.
Yes, thank you. I'll try to keep it short. I think I was totally fascinated by the graphics you showed, Tim, at the start of your presentation with the brain synchronization. And I was immediately wondering how that might factor into individual differences research or maybe personality neuroscience, because it seems like the filmic means being able to synchronize brains might be something that we can use to actually then differentiate what response we have is down to filmic means, for example, and the way they're used, and what is down to personality features that we have. And that might also be an area of research where Lucy, phenomenology and maybe especially microphenomenology could be useful, since it would be able to describe the subjective experience on a whole different level. So maybe to the both of you, are you aware of any research that's employing such strategies or combining such strategies? Or yeah, what are your thoughts just in general on that?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, and that's why I had the bell curves at the start of my talk. That often when people think about cognitive film theory, they think about describing the universal and the mean, the kind of like the average response. But that is just a representation of the center of some distribution, and the distribution is just as important. And so, you know, are we all looking at this point at that time, or is someone actually over here looking at the costume or looking at something in the background? Like, because we can say what the distribution of our sample is, we can see where they lie relative to that sample. And then that begs the question, you know, what is driving it? So yes, is it being used for studying individual differences? Absolutely. The gaze-based analysis has been used by people like Laurent Itty, who's one of the pioneers in computational saliency, to show that by looking at the variance of individual gaze points and comparing it to saliency models, you can actually start to successfully classify whether an individual has schizophrenia, whether they have autism, whether they have ADHD. Because you've got a lot of dense data of these ways in which those clinical conditions manifest through their gaze. Can it be used in the neuroimaging data? Yes, so Yuri Hasson is doing it where he's looked at autistic adults who process social information very differently, and they process the narratives and bias attention differently in the stimulus. And what's interesting to think about in the brain imaging is, because you're progressing from primary sensory areas, which are driven by the stimulus and our appraisal of it, and then as you progress through the brain, you go into areas which abstract from the stimulus more and more. So what is being perceived, what objects are being represented, how are those being tracked in time and event sequences stored into memory. There's more opportunities for idiosyncrasies to actually be introduced into that processing. And so what you might find is that individuals all look in the same place, but when you see how they're processing through the brain, and then if you ask them questions about it, you ask them to recall the stimulus, they've essentially seen something very different. And you can spot what stage of processing that's actually happening in the brain, and you can relate it to behavior. So through these techniques, there is a lot of promise. And I know groups that are following that line of saying, well, instead of doing really kind of like dense clinical assessments of individuals, just get them to watch movies. And through that data, we can do an immense amount of classification and even predictive diagnosis before individuals have that.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was a really great answer. Marina, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, we only have 5 minutes left, so just rather a comment than a question. When I was listening to Lucy's presentation, I started thinking that similar ideas are developed in other arts, in literature, for example. There is a book published by Karen Kukwin. She's a researcher in literature studies, and she published a book very recently about predictive processing in literature. She kind of says similar things about embodiment, that when we read something, a book, I mean, a novel, we kind of project, the novel acts as a rubber hand illusion. It's a famous illusion which happens when we have a feeling that a rubber hand is our own. So it's kind of when you read something or watch a movie, you have this illusion that embodied experience of other people you see in art actually your own. So you kind of perceive them like they're your own. But at the same time, it's not the same as the sense of embodiment we have in the real life, because in the real life we have the sense of agency, which we don't have when we engage with embodiment in cinema or literature. It's just fascinating how these ideas develop in completely different forms of art. And Karen, for example, says that visual imagery is even not that important in literature compared to this embodiment, because embodiment helps people to make sense, to understand the meaning of what they are reading, to experience, say, what the characters are experiencing. So it's really very interesting how these things are parallel in cinema and other forms of art, and also how artists play with it, because sometimes they kind of, for example, when they break the fourth wall, they make you pay attention to your own feelings because they kind of address you. For example, in cinema, when the character suddenly looks in the camera, there is a film of this Russian filmmaker, Zvyagintsev. There are many other filmmakers who use this, but the last shot he has in a movie, Loveless, is when the actress suddenly looks straight at you in the camera, and this should change these embodiment effects, because now you see the difference between you and as a viewer and her as an actress. The breaking of the fourth wall. I think it's kind of interesting to study how immersement changes. Our immersement changes when the fourth wall is broken. Anyway, thank you all very much. It was so interesting, both your presentations. And Tim, I'm a fan since your chapter in the book Psychocinematics. So
Thank you.
So I just wanted to give you a quick announcement that next week we meet to discuss how people perceive portraits and faces in art, and we'll have Jesse Prince and David Parrott. So I hope to see you all there. It will be extremely interesting. Thank you very much for participation, everyone, and goodbye now.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all our speakers. I'm gonna stop the recording.